Chapter 5. When Lionel drove up around 10 that morning, Rachel heard his truck and closed her bedroom door before going out to meet him. She debated whether to tell him about the wolf at all, but she trusted him completely, and discussing the odd situation with someone else would help ease her mind. Lionel climbed out of his old blue Dodge with a smile on his broad face, as always. He was built like a linebacker, which made him very handy to have around when she had to wrestle large pieces of wood into submission. She didn't have a little brother, but she would have wanted him to be sweet and funny like Lionel. He wore his dark hair down past his collar, and he shoved it away from his forehead as he walked toward her. She smiled at the unconscious gesture. When she'd hired him 2 years ago, he'd been less sure of his place in the world. Today he carried himself with the loose-hipped, casual stride of a 19-year-old who had decided he was someone of value after all. Part of that confidence might come from the talisman on a silk cord around his neck. She'd carved the small wolf for him last year, and it had become his badge of honor. It signaled to everyone in Polecat that she thought enough of him to give him a job in one of her carvings. She was grateful for the impulse that had prompted her to do both of those things. "How's it going, Miss M?" He'd come up with that nickname on his own. His grandmother was a Bette Midler fan, and he'd grown up hearing about the divine Miss M. Because he hadn't felt right calling her Rachel, he decided on Miss M, and Rachel was honored to share a nickname with Bette Midler. "I'm fine. Just wondered because you don't usually come out to meet me. Is there a problem?" "Sort of. Well, I hope not." She discovered early in their relationship that Lionel picked up on her moods very quickly. He had an artist's soul, and she'd encouraged him to try carving as a way to express his creativity. So far she'd seen no evidence he was doing it, but he could be working in secret. That would be like him to want to surprise her. "So what's going on?" She took a deep breath. "I have a wolf in my bedroom." His face turned a dull red. "I don't think you should be telling me that, Miss M. I know you've been going online looking for guys to date, but not a guy-type wolf, Lionel. An actual wolf. A big black wolf." His embarrassment was replaced with alarm. "Wow. Did you kill it?" "No. Would I do something like that?" "I didn't think so, but I can't see how you'd get a real wolf into your bedroom unless he was dead, and I thought maybe you needed help getting rid of the evidence, which I would totally do for you, even if it meant we'd get in trouble. I could still get in big trouble for not notifying Game and Fish that I have him. I took him in the house because he's hurt bad. I think he'll make it." Lionel exhaled noisily. "Good. That's very good. But listen, you should call Game and Fish right now and make up some story about why you didn't contact them earlier. I'll back you up." "I'm not calling them, Lionel. Last night this wolf came swooping in and attacked a grizzly that was about to chew me to bits." "No way. That's how he got hurt." "He might be a hybrid, but I'll bet he once belonged to someone because he's used to people and obviously thought he should protect me. But I think he's on his own now. I plan to turn him loose once I'm sure he'll be okay." "That's only fair." Lionel gazed at her, his dark eyes filled with concern. "What if he has rabies?" "I've seen no evidence of that. Remember, I'm trained as a vet." "Okay, maybe he doesn't have rabies. I suppose you'd recognize the signs. But he's still a wild animal. Wild animals can seem like they're friendly until, bam, they turn on you. There was this guy in India whose pet hippopotamus ate him. This wolf saved me from a bear. He's not going to turn around and eat me." "You can't know that for sure. Has he ever growled at you?" No, she realized that wasn't exactly true. "Well, once, but I think that was because I tried to shave his fur so I could dress his wounds. He's afraid of either the scissors or the razor, or both." "But he did growl." "You say he's in your bedroom?" "Yes." Lionel's eyebrows rose. "Did you sleep in there last night?" "I did." "So what?" "So what? He could have attacked while you were sleeping, that's what." "Well, he didn't, and I don't expect him to." "Meaning that you're going to sleep in the same room with him again tonight?" "I was planning on it." Lionel shook his head. "Bad idea, Miss M. Maybe he was too weak to attack last night, but with another day's rest, he might be a whole different wolf." "I'm not worried." "Well, I am. Can I see him?" "All right, but you have to promise me you won't tell anybody about this." Lionel looked genuinely offended. "Like I would." "I'm sorry. I know you wouldn't. But I feel protective of this wolf. I'm sure. It's the same one I saw years ago. You mean the one you took a picture of? You're absolutely sure? Because wolves can look alike, you know. This one's very distinctive. His black coat's the same and his green eyes are exactly like the one in the picture. Plus the hair on his forehead grows. So there's a faint diamond pattern to it. It's the wolf I saw, no question. Every wolf I carve is basically him. Lionel gazed at the ground as if pondering something. Finally he looked up. Again. This is starting to sound like what my grandmother studies, that tribal stuff about kindred animal spirits. I remember you telling me about that. She'd probably say you have some kind of special connection with this wolf. I think I do. So you see why I can't bring game and fish into it. I want to handle this my way. I'd still like to see him. I want you to. I'm curious as to how he'll react to another person. Especially a guy. She glanced at him. I'm making you an accomplice, though. Like I care about that. I was ready to help you bury the body. She grinned. You're a good friend, Lionel. So are you, Miss M. The best. Ready to see my big bad wolf? Lead the way. As they walked toward her front door, she looked over at him. Just so you know, if I did happen to have an actual guy-type wolf in my bedroom someday, I wouldn't tell you about it. He laughed. Good. 'Cause that would be way too much information. Jake both heard and smelled them coming and decided to crawl under the bed. He could understand why Rachel wanted some support in her wolf-saving venture. But he'd rather not have Lionel get a close look at him. The fewer humans who could ID him, the better. Rachel had the good grace to call out to him before she opened the door. Wolf? I'm bringing Lionel in to see you. He's a good guy. He won't cause you any problems, I promise. Lionel's voice penetrated the barrier of the door. Miss M, you do realize the wolf doesn't understand a word you're saying, right? I'm not so sure. Oh boy. What? I learned about that in school. It's called anthropomorphizing and it means... I know what it means. Rachel sounded irritated. I don't think this wolf is like a human, but if he lived with people and he's really smart he could understand some basic words. Yeah, like sit and stay. But you just gave him a detailed explanation of what's going on. He's not going to get all that. Then he'll understand my tone of voice and know you're not a threat. Ready? Guess so. The door opened, and from his position under the bed, Jake saw Rachel's running shoes and a pair of work boots coming in behind her. Rachel's scent was already familiar to him, too damn familiar in fact. Lionel's was not. But Jake didn't find it unpleasant. A little human sweat, a little ivory soap, a little mint aftershave. Oh dear, he's gone under the bed again. What do you mean again? Lionel didn't sound happy with the situation. Are you saying he did that before? Last night, after I got out the scissors and razor. Exactly, sweetheart. If you'd kept those things out of the mix I wouldn't have had to hide. Jake still shuddered when he thought of what might have happened if he'd been more out of it. You slept with this wolf under your bed all night? Part of the night. Lionel, he's not dangerous. How do I know that? Lionel got to his hands and knees and peered cautiously under the bed. Jesus. He looks enormous. He's pretty big. Lionel got to his feet. I don't like the idea of you staying alone in the cabin with a wild animal. Jake's laughter came out as a snort, which made his side ache. Wild animal. Indeed. Did you hear that? Lionel became more agitated. Like a sneeze or a snort or something. Probably from the dust bunnies under my bed. But there could be something wrong with him. I mean, he could have fleas or ticks. What if he brought ticks into your house and you get Lyme disease? Did you think of that? With great effort, Jake kept himself from laughing again. It hurt his side and strange noises coming from under the bed scared the shit out of Lionel. Self-respecting wouldn't tolerate the presence of a tick. But if Lionel knew Rachel had a werewolf in her house, he'd go ballistic. I'll watch out for ticks, Rachel said. But he saved my life. I owe him. What? He chose to attack the bear, but it might not have had anything to do with you. They might hate each other for other reasons and you happen to be around for the smackdown. I suppose that's always possible, but I don't think so. I think he was saving me. Miss M, don't be a hero. Call game and fish. Jake tensed. That was all he needed. I'm not doing that, Lionel. Seriously, let them come out. They can tranquilize the wolf, check him for ticks and other parasites and figure out where he came from and where he belongs. Don't you want to know that? Not really. I want him to return to whatever routine he had before he rushed in to save me. I don't need to know all the details about his life. Lionel blew out a breath. I think you're asking for trouble keeping him here. But it's your decision. It is, and I'll deal with any consequences. But you have to promise me, if this turns into a big problem, you'll call me. You'd still help? Even if I'm ignoring your advice about notifying the authorities? You bet I would, Miss M. If you don't want anybody to know about this wolf, then that's the way it'll be. If he turns rabid and you need me to come and shoot him for you, I'll do that. Rachel gasped. Nobody is shooting this wolf. If he becomes a danger to you, or if he harms a single hair on your head, I'll shoot him without a second thought. Jake didn't relish being shot, but he was glad to hear that Lionel was so protective. Somehow he'd make sure Lionel was aware of a grizzly in the neighborhood, and then Jake could leave for San Francisco without worrying so much about Rachel's safety. Before he could catch that plane, though, he had to get out of this cabin. The wolf's no danger to me, Rachel said, but I appreciate your support. Anytime. I guess he's not going to come out from under the bed, so we may as well leave. We both have work to do. Yeah, how's the triptych coming along? Lionel moved toward the door. I'm making progress. Rachel followed him. I'd like your opinion. Oh, and I've created an unholy mess in the shop. Sawdust everywhere. I'm sure. Lionel chuckled. Hey, that carving on your mantel wasn't there last time I was in here. Where'd it come from? I sold that to Jake Hunter 3 years ago. He didn't want it anymore, so I have it back. What, is he dumb or something? Yes, I think he is. She closed the bedroom door. Jake felt about as dumb as Lionel thought he was. What a situation he'd created for himself. He waited several minutes before he crawled out from under the bed. If he could be sure they'd leave him alone for a while, he could shift to human form and back to wolf form to speed the healing. In fact, in human form he could crack the front door a couple of inches so that he could leave as a wolf. He'd have to be very sure she wouldn't come in, though, because if she found him naked in her cabin, that would be extremely difficult to explain. But if he could pull off the maneuver, he'd be able to leave today. Rachel might think she'd left the door open by mistake. Just as his plan began to seem possible, the bedroom door creaked and Rachel walked in. I knew you'd come out once Lionel was gone, Wolf. He stood still and watched her. I still think you understand a lot of what we say, and that conversation I had with Lionel might have spooked you. But don't worry. I'm not going to call in the troops. This is between you and me, and you can trust Lionel not to squeal on us. Thank you. He hoped she could sense his gratitude. You're welcome. Wow, that was strange. She'd responded as if she'd picked up on his thoughts. I'm going out to the workshop now, but I'll come back from time to time and check on you. I'm not leaving you alone for the day, so don't worry about that either. Please do leave me alone. She smiled. It's like I can see the wheels turning in there. You're too clever. I'm not giving you hours of solitude so you can figure out some way to. Damn. Boy, do you look disappointed. I swear you got the gist of what I just said. Well, just forget about escaping. You need more time to heal, and this is the best place to do that. Says you. Don't look at me like that, as if you don't believe me. I'm a doctor, or I was almost a doctor. I can tell that you're super smart, but I know more about this process than you do, so why not relax and let me do my thing? Her logic was impeccable, but she was working with the wrong information. If he were a true wolf, she'd be absolutely doing the right thing for him. She couldn't know that she was impeding the healing process. Because he'd been unable to shift fully soon after his injury, he would likely have scarring, something that didn't happen when Wers took care of their wounds themselves. He'd been hurt several times in his life, and he bore no marks as a result. But he felt certain he'd end up with red welts from the bear's claws once he became human again. In time they'd fade, but his skin would never be perfect again. In some ways that seemed fitting. It was as if Rachel herself had left her mark on him. He might as well accept the inevitability of that and realize that he would never completely erase her memory. See you soon, Wolf. She had the audacity to wink before she turned, walked out the door, and closed it firmly behind her. Curses foiled again. Chapter 6. Rachel's famous concentration took a beating the rest of the morning. Even Lionel remarked on it. She kept pausing in her work to check on the wolf and, when she returned, she spent long moments staring into space, her carving tools lying unused on her bench. Finally she turned to Lionel. How are you at tracking? Okay, I guess. He dumped a large dustpan full of shavings into a plastic garbage can. I learned from my best friend Willie's dad on account of mine not being around to teach me. He said it without a trace of resentment or self-pity. His dad had left when he was a baby, and he'd been raised by his mother and grandmother, but he'd never said a word against his absent father. If I let the wolf go tonight, do you think you could track where he goes? Lionel stopped sweeping to glance at her. I thought you didn't want to know his story. I don't, and if I could keep him a few more days I wouldn't be worried. But I can't figure out how to do that. He'll need to go outside again tonight and I won't be able to trick him again. Again? You already tricked him once. Yeah, and it cost me a very large stake. She described her maneuver, which made Lionel chuckle. Anyway, the fishing line won't work twice, so when I let him out to do his business, he'll be gone. And you want me to follow him? Not so he'd know. He's very smart. That's why I thought if you could track him from a distance, then you'd have some idea of where he goes, but he wouldn't know you were doing it. I could try, but Willie's dad could do a better job than me. Even Willie's a better tracker than I am. Rachel shook her head. I don't care. I don't want anyone else in on this, so I'll pay you for your time. Hell no, you won't. I'm already aiding and abetting you instead of notifying. Game and fish. If I take money for it, that'll look even worse. Would you rather not do it at all? He grinned at her. Are you kidding? I'm dying to do it. First of all, I'm really happy that you're getting this wolf out of your house before something bad happens. Second of all, I want to know where he heads off to as much as you, maybe more. This job has always been interesting, but today's been the most interesting so far. Glad I'm proving to be entertaining. Definitely. What time are you planning to let him go? As late as possible. She glanced at the clock on the workshop wall. I'm not sure how long he can make it without needing a trip outside. I can't say for wolves, but a big dog can go about 10 hours, maybe a little longer if they have to. You think this wolf is housebroken, right? She nodded. He seems to be. Anyway, that still puts us at 6 or 7. Tonight. The sun's very bright then. So what are you going to do? Don't have much choice. He'll have to do the best he can to stay hidden. At least tracking him should be easier. It should, but, he sighed. Seriously, I'm not a very good tracker. At least you know something about it, which is more than I can say. Can you also look for blood spots along the way? In case he starts bleeding again. And what if he does? Does it matter? She thought about that. Good point. Once he's loose, there will be no getting him back. If I could think of some way to let him out on a temporary basis, I'd do it, but it's not as if I can take him out on a leash like a poodle. Nope. Lionel gazed at her. If you're that worried about whether he'll survive on his own, there's always game and fish. At least then you'd know that I'd know that he'd be miserable, and I would have broken the promise I made to him last night. But for his own good. Would it be? My instincts tell me that given the choice, he'd rather die on his own terms than deal with more human interference. Then I guess it's settled. Lionel's phone chimed, signaling the end of his workday with Rachel. He silenced the alarm. I need to get over to the mill. Just tell me when you want me here. Plan on 7. Rachel wished she had reason to employ him full-time so he didn't have to work at the sawmill 30 miles away. But cleaning the shop, buying groceries once in a while, and helping her with heavy pieces of wood didn't take 40 hours a week. I'll be here. I'll call you when I'm getting ready to let him out. If you park on the road instead of driving in, then he won't know you're coming. Lionel nodded. I really appreciate this. Are you sure I can't pay you extra? I'm sure. He glanced at a wooden shelving unit that held various pieces of wood waiting to become Rachel Miller originals. He pointed to a gnarled piece of cedar about 2 feet long. If you'd be willing to let me have that, I'd consider us even. She happened to love that particular piece and had looked forward to carving. But she was desperate for Lionel's tracking skills, and she was also thrilled at this first indication that he'd taken her suggestion about perfecting his own carving skills. It's yours. Really? I was sort of kidding. That's a beautiful hunk of wood. You don't have to give it to me. I'm sure you could make something amazing out of it. Sliding off her work stool, she walked over to the shelf and picked up the cedar. I'll bet you could too. I only have one condition. Let me see it when you're finished. Using both hands, she held it out. Instead of taking it, he stepped back. Never mind. That was a dumb impulse on my part. I'm not ready for wood that beautiful. Lionel, you are ready, or you wouldn't have asked for it. Don't wimp out on me. He eyed the wood. I'll probably screw it up. That's not the best attitude for beginning a new project. Try again. You're really putting me on the spot, Miss M. I mean to. She continued to gaze at him. Daring to be an artist takes guts. You've only been here during the glory days, but I went through a lot of self-doubt before I arrived where I am now. I still have self-doubt. You? That's ridiculous. Probably, but it's true. So man up, Lionel. Take this piece of wood, put your heart and soul into carving it, and then show me the results. Because that's what artists do. They put their heart and soul out there for everyone to see. Lionel swallowed. Okay. Moving toward her, he took the piece of wood. Don't expect miracles, okay? I always expect miracles. She smiled at him. And so should you. See you tonight. When Rachel didn't come in to check on Jake all afternoon, he wondered what was up. She'd made a pest of herself in the morning, and then had left him completely alone in the afternoon. But he hadn't been able to trust her absence enough to try a double shift. It had turned out to be a very long afternoon. Toward the end of it, he desperately needed to relieve himself. He wondered how she planned to handle that. She couldn't try the fishing line again, so how could she expect to let him out and get him back in the house? Around 6 he heard her come in the cabin, but she didn't open the bedroom door. He paced the bedroom while he waited to see what would happen next. She had to let him out. And then what? He was also hungry, but not as famished as he had been this morning. She tried to bribe him with food again. He wouldn't be as susceptible. The ding of a microwave made him curious. Was she nuking her dinner, his dinner, or both? The overriding concern, though, was the pressure on his bladder. She had to know he was in dire straits. Once she opened that back door, their time together would be over. Surely she knew that too. He scented her approach to the bedroom, both because he was attuned to her aroma and because his nose told him she carried a bowl of raw hamburger. Sadly, he was more eager to see her than to eat the hamburger. That indicated how enmeshed he'd become. Halting his pacing, he faced the door. Considering the microwave ding he'd heard earlier, she must have used it to defrost some ground round from the freezer. Damn, he was turning into a regular Sherlock Holmes. He appreciated the thought of the raw hamburger, but he looked forward to shifting back to human form. These days he preferred his meals cooked and preferably seasoned. He longed for a few side dishes and a bottle of good red wine. She wouldn't know that, of course. She viewed him as a wild animal that caught its prey on the run. Werewolves hadn't done that for centuries. Despite his surname, Jake had never hunted anything, and the concept made him shudder. As a carnivore, he required daily helpings of meat. As a thinking carnivore, he understood that somebody had to provide the fine cuts of sirloin that he enjoyed, but he preferred not to dwell on what he considered an unsavory process. I've brought your dinner. She left the bedroom door open as she crossed the room and put the bowl in front of him. He had to pee, but he wasn't about to turn down the possibility of food. She didn't seem to be using the hamburger as a trick to get him back inside this time, and he was grateful for that. He began gulping down the ground meat. Halfway through he paused. She could have buried a knockout pill in the hamburger and he'd never know. He glanced up. Did you hide a pill in this meat? It's okay, Wolf. You can eat it. No tricks. She crouched down so they were eye to eye. I'm going to let you go. His heart thumped faster. Freedom. You understood that, didn't you? I have a feeling if scientists ever examined your brain, they discover you're a superintelligent wolf. If any scientist examined his brain and reported the findings, they'd risk ruining their reputation. Everyone knew werewolves were mythical creatures. He pitted the poor scientist who dared to claim that they weren't. I'm letting you out because there's no way I can keep you any longer. We both know you have to go outside and take care of some necessary business. Figured out a way to fool you this morning, but that won't work again, will it? He lowered his head and kept eating, but he trembled with excitement at the prospect of escaping at last. From the corner of his eye he evaluated the light coming through her bedroom window. Too much light, but he couldn't be particular. If she opened that back door, then he would take off. I'm still worried about you. I doubt you'd let me examine your wounds, and besides, I'd have a tough time seeing anything with all that fur in the way. They don't seem to be bleeding anymore though, and maybe you'll be okay. Hope so. He was touched by the genuine concern in her voice. As much as he needed to leave, he would miss her. He'd been an intimate part of her life for nearly 24 hours, and she'd proven to be every bit as wonderful as he'd imagined. Too bad. He'd have to be content with his memories. He took some satisfaction in knowing that she was likely to remember this interlude for a long time. Wasn't every day that a woman brought a wolf into her bedroom, and she didn't know the half of it. He supposed that eventually she'd find a man to love, and she'd tell him about the brave wolf that had defended her from a mother grizzly. Jake didn't like thinking about her with someone else, but there could be no other outcome. He would end up with someone else too, maybe even Giselle Landry. So I want you to be really careful after you leave here, she said. I wish you'd stay until it's a little darker, but I know you won't. It's just that you're black, and if someone sees you, I worry that maybe they'll be awestruck the way I was when I saw you years ago, and they'll leave you alone. It wasn't me you saw. It was my father. It was you, so don't try to convince me it wasn't. His head came up and he looked into her eyes. Had she just replied to his telepathic thought? I will say though that I haven't been carving your nose quite right. Thought it was a little longer and sharper than that. Exactly, because you saw my dad. But it had to be you. How many others could there be with those distinctive green eyes, thick black coat, and a diamond pattern on your forehead? You're very unusual looking, and larger than most wolves too. Right, but I'm not a... He caught himself before he finished the sentence. He was only thinking, but he had an uneasy feeling she was getting some of that transmission. He didn't want to take a chance he'd plant an idea in her head. Anyway, I'll miss you, Wolf. I wouldn't mind having you drop by now and then. But I don't suppose that's wise. The more often you're spotted near a residence, the more likely someone will decide you're a danger to small children and lapdogs. You need to stay away from people. Promise I'll be more careful about bears from now on, so you can relax on that score. He couldn't seem to stop gazing at her. She was so beautiful, with her soft hair framing her face and her gray eyes filled with affection for him. He could easily stay away from other humans, but he wasn't sure if he'd be able to stay away from her. Go on now. Eat your hamburger. Reaching out, she stroked his head. I didn't mean to distract you. The warmth of her touch ran through him like a jolt of electricity. He quivered in reaction. Your coat is incredibly soft. I always imagined it would be coarse, but it's not. She looked into his eyes as she combed her fingers through his fur. We do have a connection, don't we? Yes. He leaned into her caress. I think that's very cool, but I don't want to put you in danger. With a sigh, she lifted her hand and stood. Please don't stop stroking me. Finish that hamburger. It's time you were on your way. He swallowed a whine of longing. The urge to stay and somehow blend their two very different worlds had become powerful, almost too powerful to resist. No doubt the Wallace brothers had felt this way, and they'd succumbed. He would not, by God. He would not. Summoning all his willpower, he returned his attention to the hamburger and finished it off. When he looked up, she'd moved into the living room. He walked out of her bedroom knowing he'd never see it again. Good thing he needed a bathroom break. At this moment it was the only thing propelling him out the door. Yet his belief in a clean separation of the two species, human and were, was the only world order that made sense to him. He had to adhere to it, no matter how much he longed to hold on to his connection with Rachel. Come on, Wolf. Let's get this over with. Striding toward the back door, she opened it with a dramatic flourish. I'll bet you can hardly wait to be free. Again. No. I want to stay. She turned back to him, her expression puzzled. You do want to leave, right? There was only one good answer to that. Lifting his head, he met her gaze. Yes. I thought so. She opened the screen door and held it for him as she walked out on the deck. Then go, Wolf. And don't pick any more fights with bears. Okay. To his astonishment, she sounded emotional. as if she might be on the verge of tears. I won't. Good, she murmured. Now take off. He did. This time when he bounded down the steps he didn't stumble. He was stronger now. At the bottom he looked back. She stood with her arms wrapped protectively around her midsection, as if in pain. Her expression was bleak. Go, she called out. He sprinted for the trees. Lingering would only make everything tougher on both of them. Later, after he'd emptied his bladder and started the journey back home, he realized that she'd made some response to every telepathic thought he'd had. That wasn't supposed to be possible. Chapter 7. Rachel pulled her phone out of her pocket and pressed the buttons that connected her to Lionel. He's taken off. He went to the right, headed around the lake. Lionel's voice came through the phone. I'm on it. How is he? I hope he's strong enough. It was weird though. I imagined I could hear him thinking. Yeah, well, you know what they say about artists. A little bit strange. I know. Flaky as hell. Follow him, okay? I need to know he's made it to wherever he's going. I'll do my best. Text me if you get a chance to let me know the situation. I will. Go pour yourself a glass of wine and relax. Fat chance. She disconnected and stood staring at the spot in the woods where the wolf had disappeared. Stay safe, wolf. An answer popped into her head, as if from a radio transmission. Always, Rachel. She told herself she'd imagined the response. She'd wanted to believe he was okay, and she'd fabricated his telepathic message to make her feel secure. But then she thought over their last few minutes together and what she'd admitted to Lionel. While she talked to the wolf and stroked his fur, he'd looked into her eyes, as if absorbing every word. She'd swear that he responded somehow because she'd felt communication flow between them. No doubt she was letting her overactive imagination run away with her again. She couldn't really read a wolf's mind. But what if she could? She'd heard of people who communicated mentally with dogs, cats, even horses. Why couldn't she receive the transmissions of this wolf, especially if they had a special connection? Closing her eyes, she tried to tune in again, but all she got was static. She sent out a question. Where are you? No answer came back. That made sense. He was running for his life and concentrating on protecting himself. He wouldn't have time to play telepathy games with her. No, she couldn't expect little messages of comfort when his very existence was in jeopardy. But she couldn't leave the deck and go back inside. That would seem like deserting him. So she'd stay right here and enjoy the view, something she didn't do often. Enough. Polecat Lake, despite its unlovely name, was gorgeous. Evergreens framed the waterline except for the mirror image clearings where her cabin sat on one side and Jake's on the other. Off to her right, a vista both she and Jake could enjoy. Mountains rose in eternally snow-capped splendor. Had she been a painter instead of a carver, she'd be moved to capture them with her brush. But she'd always been drawn to the tactile pleasure of woodworking. The cell phone in her hand chimed. Eager for news, she opened the text from Lionel. Picked up his trail. No blood. She answered back immediately. Good. Knowing that the wolf wasn't bleeding loomed large in her mind. He had to make it to safety. He had to. Humans must avoid. She drew in a quick breath. She hadn't imagined that communication. The words had come through clearly, and they could only be from one source. Somehow in the time they'd spent together, she'd managed to tune in. The connection wasn't perfect or constant, but in times of intense concentration on the wolf's welfare, she was able to pick up his thoughts. Leaning against the deck railing, she clutched the weathered wood with both hands and focused on the wolf. If he was in danger from the humans he'd sensed nearby, she'd hear his panic. She could text Lionel, who might be able to get there in time to intercede. Made it past them. Her shoulders sagged in relief. Tired. Her tummy churned. Should he stop and rest? She had no idea. She didn't know how far he had to go before he was safe. Getting close, though. That was good news. She wondered if he'd moved deeper into the forest. Maybe he had a cave back in there, away from the frequently traveled hiking trails. Thank heavens Lionel was young and fit, because he'd have the stamina to follow the wolf to wherever he was going. Her cell phone chimed again. Weird, Lionel texted. Moving towards Mr. Hunter's cabin. Jake Hunter? Yep. Wolf stopped in trees. I'm pulling back. Don't let him see you. I won't. Rachel whirled and ran back inside to get her binoculars. Suddenly things were starting to make sense. If anyone in the neighborhood would keep a pet wolf, it would be Jake. He was something of a lone wolf himself. She thought of his green eyes so like the wolf's. Maybe Jake felt a kinship there. He'd also been quick to buy that carving. She couldn't figure out why. He wanted to get rid of it now, though. As she trained her binoculars on Jake's cabin, she pondered his odd behavior. Regarding the carving, maybe he planned to surrender the wolf to a zoo or sanctuary, so he might be riddled with guilt. Now that she'd spent time with that magnificent animal, she certainly would feel guilty doing such a thing. If Jake planned to surrender the wolf, he wouldn't want the carving around to remind him of his former companion. She couldn't know any of that for sure, but she intended to find out. She owed the wolf her life, and she was going to protect it from any threat, especially if that threat came from Jake Hunter. Her phone chimed again. Holding her binoculars with one hand, she pulled out her phone and took a quick look at Lionel's text. "Can you see him?" She put down the binoculars long enough to send a reply. "No. In trees near Mr. Hunter's place." Picking up the binoculars again, she focused them on the tree line to the right of Jake's cabin. Deep shadows pooled under the trees made seeing anything difficult, but there, that darker shape could be him. She watched a moment longer and decided it very well could be him. She laid the binoculars on the railing and texted Lionel. "Think I see him? Want me to keep watching?" "No. Go on home. And thanks." "Welcome." Rachel tucked her phone away and picked up the binoculars again. Yes, she was now almost positive that black shadow under a large pine tree was the wolf. Lying down, she tried tuning into his thoughts but got nothing. Poor injured wolf. He was probably worn out from the effort to get around the lake without being seen. He still instinctively stayed out of sight, and Jake, if the wolf indeed belonged to him, would have reinforced that instinct. If the cabin was the wolf's ultimate destination, he'd have to cross that treeless stretch which was currently bathed in sunlight. Another hour in it would be shaded, though. Another hour after that, and it would be nearly time for Jake's nightly skinny dipping session. Had he been at all worried that his wolf had been gone for 24 hours? Of course, she still couldn't prove for certain that the wolf was his, but the evidence was mounting. If the wolf went up to the cabin, then she could justify driving over there. Jake must have really kept that animal under wraps, though. She'd never seen it except for one glimpse 4 years ago. The wolf was news to Lionel. Obviously, Ted might know. She decided to call him. But first she dragged an Adirondack chair over to the railing and made herself comfortable. If she was right about the wolf's plan, she had an hour to wait before he made his move. Propping her elbow on the flat arm of the chair, she braced herself so she could look through the binoculars while talking on the phone. Ted answered, but there was noise in the background. Oh right. He hosted some guys for a poker party once a week, and this was the night. She modified the question she'd been about to ask, because she didn't want Ted to discuss potential wolf ownership with his cronies. "Sorry to bother you on poker night," she said, "but I have a quick question." "Sure. I had a lousy hand anyway. Does Jake Hunter have a dog?" "I don't think so." "Why?" She came up with the first lie she could think of. "I heard of someone who has puppies they're trying to give away, and I thought of Jake. He's not really a good candidate. He's away from home as much as you are. I'd be really surprised if he decided to get a dog." "Yeah, guess you're right. It was a thought. Have fun with your buddies." "Thanks. Fortunately, I'm not in it for profit." "That's a good attitude, Ted. See you later." She disconnected. Good old Ted wasn't motivated by profit in any sense. She suspected that with his overhead he barely broke even at the general store. But he made enough to live on and stay in the place he loved best on earth. That was nothing to sneeze at. Meanwhile, Jake Hunter apparently made a tidy profit with his wilderness guiding business. She had no quarrel with his success, but she wondered if his long absences meant he was shirking his responsibility to the wolf, the one that nobody seemed to know about. That was assuming the wolf was his, or at least used his cabin as a home base. She still couldn't prove that for sure, but she was determined to find out. Settling back in her chair, she adjusted the focus on the binoculars and prepared to wait for shade to find that open stretch between the tree line and Jake's cabin. She didn't mind the waiting, but she was getting hungry. Candy bars waited in her kitchen, but she didn't dare go get them and risk missing the wolf when he moved. She felt certain he wouldn't stay where he was. Gut instinct told her Jake's cabin was his final destination. But she had to be sure before she went over there. Assuming she did that, she might want to decide what she planned to say. For starters, she'd ask if the wolf was his. Whether he admitted it or not, she'd know from his answer. She was good at reading people. Then she'd tell him about the incident with the grizzly and how she'd tended the wolf's injuries. Last of all, she'd ask if he intended to keep the wolf or turn him over to a zoo or wildlife sanctuary. If she could get him to admit that, then she would offer to take the animal herself. How that would fit into her life was a big unanswered question. She'd already debated the issue and had decided she couldn't commit to keeping any animal, let alone a wolf. But this was the creature that had saved her life, and she would do whatever was necessary to ensure his welfare. Maybe she could ask Lionel to help out when she had to travel. She could cut down on the number of trips too. Some commissions required her to be there during the installation and some didn't. She could become pickier about which job she accepted. Thinking about that, she realized it was past time to stop agreeing to every offer that came her way. She had enough money invested to make her financially comfortable even if she never carved another piece. She would always carve, because that was her passion, but she could be more selective about it. If she stayed home more, she might have a better chance of finding a soul mate. She could concentrate on it instead of trying to grab moments to find a match online. She knew in her heart that finding the right man required as much dedication as she devoted to her art, but she hadn't been willing to make that kind of commitment. Perhaps the wolf had come partly to teach her that she needed to do so. Jake was no longer willing to be the wolf's guardian. Then she would take over and allow that to be the beginning of a new life, a new attitude. The more she considered that, the better she liked the idea. Shifting every so often to make sure her arm didn't go numb, she continued to watch the tree line. The wolf might not want to come with her initially, but she'd win him over. Once he realized that Jake was thinking out on him, he might be grateful for someone who would buy him round steak and give him a soft bed on cold nights. Daydreaming about her new, more peaceful life with a lighter workload, companion animal, and perhaps the love of her life, made her lose track of time. With a start, she realized the shade had reached the edge of Jake's deck, and the dark outline she'd identified as the wolf was moving. Adrenaline made her shaky, but she forced herself to hold the binoculars steady as she followed the progress of that dark shape. It was her wolf, all right. Sometime in the past hour she'd started thinking of him as hers. Sure enough, he moved cautiously in the direction of Jake's cabin. He looked ready to bolt at the slightest threat. Jake should be there. Anger simmered at his laissez-faire attitude toward this creature. Neither totally wild nor totally tame, the wolf was caught in between worlds and needed human protection. If Jake wouldn't provide that, then she would. Filled with righteous indignation, she watched the wolf slink up the steps to Jake's deck. Still no Jake. Was he relaxing with a beer while an injured wolf, desperate for shelter and care, crept into his cabin? What an insensitive idiot. The creep didn't deserve the wolf's loyalty, but the wolf probably gave it without question. As she watched, the wolf reached the sliding door and nosed it open. Then he slipped quickly inside. Rachel lowered the binoculars and stood. She probably shouldn't storm over there right now when she was furious with the arrogant bastard, but she was going to anyway. She couldn't let that wolf spend another night under the roof of a man who cared so little. She stopped in the kitchen for a couple of candy bars, which she began eating on the way out to her truck, so she'd confront him while she was angry and on a sugar high. So what? That might be the best way to deal with someone as obtuse as he appeared to be. Sometime during the drive around the lake, as she finished off the second candy bar and tossed the wrapper onto the passenger seat, she remembered that Jake was the guy who had been her first customer. That sale had jump-started her career. She was grateful for that, but bastards could do good things without realizing they were doing them. She thought Jake fit in that category. Jake wasn't her concern anyway. She was focused on the wolf and how she would get him away from Jake and into her truck. If Jake was tired of taking care of the wolf, then her job would be easy. Well, maybe not if she approached him in a belligerent way. Any hope that he wouldn't be there, which would excuse his lack of empathy for the current situation, vanished as she pulled up beside his truck, which was parked beside his cabin. He was there all right and likely had been inside. His comfy home during the whole sorry drama. Meanwhile, his pet wolf had feared for his life. Apparently Jake didn't give a damn. By the time she tromped up his front steps, she was spitting nails. He had a noble animal under his care, and he wasn't paying the least attention. She hoped he was prepared to turn the wolf over to someone else because she was ready. She knocked on the screen door and got no response. The interior door was closed, so she opened the screen and pounded on the wooden door. Still no answer. She wasn't about to leave without having a conversation with Mr. Jake Hunter, so she banged louder. "I know you're in there, Jake," she called. "And I'm not leaving until you open the door. I want to talk about your wolf." She'd raised her fist to pound again when the door swung open. Jake stood there in a pair of sweats and nothing else. As always, he looked amazing. If she hadn't been so enraged about his behavior, she might have enjoyed the sight. Apparently he'd had some accident recently though, because a series of red welts marked his left side, and his nose was bruised. Maybe he'd been in a fight. She looked into his green eyes, so like the eyes of the wolf she'd nursed through the first few hours after the grisly attack. When she'd gazed into his eyes 3 years ago, they'd been warm and full of interest. Now they were like chips of green glass, cold and hard. He said nothing. Not hello or come in, or even what do you want. He just stared at her as if hoping she'd take the hint and leave. Well, that wasn't happening. "Mr. I have a great body and I know it was going to answer her questions. A wolf let himself into your house a little while ago. Where is he?" Jake's expression didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh yes you do. You're keeping a wolf, either full-blooded or a hybrid, on your property." "No, I'm not. Look, I'm not going to report you for it, so you don't have to lie. Reporting you is the last thing I want to do. I'm not worried about what would happen to you, but I don't want that wolf confiscated or transported somewhere. Polecat Lake is his home, and he deserves to stay here." Jake met that speech with more stony silence. "Just tell me this. Are you planning to turn him over to a zoo or a sanctuary? That's the only thing I can figure out, since you were so hot to get rid of my carving. If you're giving up custody of the wolf, then you probably didn't want the carving that looks exactly like him either." He studied her for a moment longer. Then he sighed. "Ted Haggerty always said, you have an incredible imagination. He must be right if you imagine that you saw a wolf waltz into my house. There's no wolf here. There never has been a wolf here. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some things to do." He started to close the door. "Don't you dare dismiss me." She stepped over the threshold. Let him throw her bodily out if he had the guts to do it. "The wolf is not a figment of my imagination, and you damned well know it. Where is he?" With a shrug that made all those yummy muscles flex, Jake stepped back. "Go ahead. Look around. Maybe this wolf," he used air quotes to emphasize his mocking tone, "crept into my house without my knowledge. Maybe he's hiding under the bed. Search the place if that will make you happy. See? You know he likes to hide under the bed." She was determined not to be distracted by all that bare skin. And where had he picked up those welts? Anyway, any frightened creature dives under the bed. "If you think I won't look there because I don't want to seem crazy, forget it." She stormed past him. God, but he smelled good. One quick glance around his combination living and dining room, which looked similar to hers in both layout and furnishings, convinced her that a large black wolf wasn't there. She noticed that the kitchen had a pocket door like hers, so she walked in there, thinking she might find a water dish and a food bowl on the floor. He wouldn't have had time to hide every bit of evidence. The kitchen yielded nothing of interest. No food or water bowls. No dirty dishes in the sink either. Either the guy was neat or he ate out a lot. With one last survey to make sure she hadn't missed any telltale signs of a wolf in residence, she left the kitchen and started for his bedroom. He came walking out of it pulling on a plain white t-shirt. She appreciated his decision to put on more clothes. After all the time she'd ogled his naked body through her binoculars, she had difficulty ignoring the close and personal view. This visit was about wolf welfare, not her infatuation with Jake's physique. "I want to look in your bedroom." He stepped aside and swept an arm in that direction. "Thank you." Keeping her mind on her mission, she walked in. The bed, of course, was sinfully enormous. It was probably one of those super kings which a man of his size needed. A comforter in shades of green covered the thick mattress. He'd stacked 4 pillows against the rustic wooden headboard. An image of him sprawled naked on that magnificent bed popped into her rebellious brain and wouldn't leave. Don't care, don't care, don't care, she muttered, hoping she could make it be true. Dropping to her knees, she peeked under the bed. Empty. Damn it. She'd wanted to catch him in the lie. Pushing herself upright again, she turned to find him leaning in the doorway, watching her. Did you let him out again? I sure hope not, because he's wounded. Or did you miss that little fact? Sorry, but I haven't seen a wolf around here, wounded or otherwise. She hated the way his direct gaze affected her, making her doubt what she'd seen with her own 2 eyes. He's big and black with green eyes. He fought a grizzly last night, I'm pretty sure, to save me, and the bear raked her claws down his side. A wolf attacked a bear to save you? That sounds like something out of the tabloids. Are you sure that's what happened? Of course I'm sure. I kept him overnight because I was worried the wounds would get infected. But I let him out tonight and he came around the lake and opened your slider. I saw him do it. How could you possibly see such a thing? I watched through my binoculars. His dark eyebrows lifted. Are you in the habit of watching my place? Dear God, now she was blushing. She felt the heat in her cheeks and glanced away. No, not really. She wasn't good at lying when she was face to face with someone. But tonight I was worried about the wolf. Now I'll tell you what really happened. Oh, because you know? She retrieved her indignation and pulled it around her like a cloak. She didn't have to wonder where he got that bruise on his nose. Somebody had probably punched him for being so damned arrogant. The explanation is pretty obvious. You became very attached to this wolf, which supposedly saved you. Yes, I did, and it absolutely saved me. Whatever. Anyway, after you let him go, he headed into the hills like any self-respecting wolf would do. But you desperately wanted to see him again, so when a cloud overhead created a shadow on my deck, you convinced yourself the wolf was here in my house. That's not right. But the wolf was no longer in his house, so she'd have a hard time contradicting his story. She told Lionel to go home, so she was the only one who'd watched the wolf go through the slider, and she was famous in Polecat for her active imagination. You can continue to think what you like. He pushed himself away from the doorframe. But if you'll excuse me, I have things to do. Why did you give Ted that carving? He looked straight at her. Got tired of it. Ouch. Well, she'd asked him after all. She couldn't complain if she didn't like the answer. You could have sold it for a lot of money. Didn't want the hassle. Are we done here? Yes. She'd taken about all the insults she could handle for one evening. We're so done. Good. He walked into the living room and opened the front door. She couldn't get through it fast enough. Have a nice night, he called after her. Spinning around, she let go with a parting shot. I know you're connected to that wolf, and somehow I'm going to prove it. No, you're not. Goodbye, Rachel. He closed the door. She wanted to yell in frustration, but that wouldn't accomplish anything and might startle any wild creatures nearby, including perhaps the wolf in question. Climbing in her truck, she pulled onto the 2-lane road. Instead of going back the way she'd come, she drove slowly the other way and peered into the woods. Are you out there, wolf? She tried to tune into his mind, but all she got was static. After being the most real thing in her life for 24 hours, he seemed to have totally disappeared. Chapter 8. On his flight to San Francisco 2 days later, Jake vowed to put the incident with Rachel behind him. Talking about it might have helped, but he couldn't confide in any of his were friends. He'd built a reputation as a crusader against were-human mating, so how could he admit that a human had tempted him so much he'd almost blown his cover? Besides, it wouldn't happen again. This trip away from Polecat and Rachel would allow him to refocus. Meeting with Giselle Landry, who shared his objections to were-human mating, would help too. His plane touched down a few minutes past 8 in the evening. As it taxied toward the gate, he called Giselle, even though their appointment wasn't until the next morning. Is it too late to meet for a drink? He hoped not. He'd been alone with his thoughts far too much in the past 48 hours, and he needed to get his mind off his problems. It's not too late. She sounded frazzled. But I should warn you, I'm not good company right now. Hey, if you'd rather not, that's okay. He tamped down his disappointment. I'll be at your office at 10 tomorrow and we can talk then. Actually, the idea of relaxing over a glass of vino sounds wonderful. I just can't promise I won't start whining. You can whine all you want, Giselle. I'll catch a cab to the Fairmont and meet you in the bar. Meet me in the lobby instead, okay? I know a great little war-owned place. Down by Fisherman's Wharf. Perfect. Jake's spirits lifted. Listening to Giselle's troubles, whatever they might be, would take his mind off his own. He also looked forward to a night surrounded by his own kind. His preference for being a lone wolf had its drawbacks and probably made him more vulnerable to temptation of the Rachel variety. Okay, Giselle said. See you in about an hour. If you'll tell me what you're driving, I can wait outside for you. A Harley. He laughed. Excellent. Riding behind Giselle while she navigated San Francisco's hills on her motorcycle sounded like exactly what he needed. See you soon. As he disconnected, he wondered if someday Giselle could be more than a friend. While he was here, he'd keep his mind open to the possibility. An hour later, he stood outside the Fairmont as the fog rolled in. Great night. For a couple of werewolves. He scanned the area for a motorcycle and here she came materializing out of the mist. She'd gone with all black jacket, pants, boots and bike. He wouldn't have known for sure it was her until he noticed a stray lock of dark red hair that had escaped from under her black helmet. She spotted him and veered in his direction. Hi there, Jake. She put down booted foot but left the motor running as she reached behind her and came up with a second helmet and goggles to match hers. Put these on. Thanks. Knowing he'd be a passenger on her Harley, he'd worn jeans and a sweatshirt over his t-shirt. After putting on the helmet and goggles, he climbed onto the cushioned seat behind her. All set, she called over her shoulder. Go for it. She took off with a roar, and he steadied himself by holding onto her waist. The ride sent a welcome surge of adrenaline through him. He tried to convince himself that touching Giselle had something to do with it too. But when he compared his reaction to Giselle with what he'd felt with Rachel, damn it, was he doomed to constantly reference Rachel whenever he came in contact with another female? That would suck. Well, even if he didn't feel any sparks with Giselle, he loved riding on her motorcycle. She turned the streets of San Francisco into her own personal roller coaster, something she obviously relished doing. She'd mentioned having problems, so this wild race through the foggy night might be helping her release some tension too. Jake was almost sorry when they reached the harbor and she parked the Harley. That was great, he said as he climbed off. I took the long way. Hope you didn't mind. Nope. Loved it. After taking off his goggles and helmet, he glanced at the bar she brought him to, a cozy-looking place with a wooden sign announcing it was the Denver. He smiled. Clever name. No one would guess. No, they don't. She removed her helmet and shook out her wavy red hair. They think it's just another bar. But even so, humans don't tend to stick around after they've wandered in. On some level they must realize these aren't their peeps. I appreciate you bringing me here. It's exactly what I need right now. I'm pretty isolated in Polecat. She tucked her goggles inside her helmet and started toward the bar. What about the Hunter Pack? It's based in Idaho. I guess I didn't realize that. Most wars live where their pack lives, so I naturally thought you. I like Alaska better. He opened the bar's wooden door and held it for her. So you really are a lone wolf? I suppose I am. He hadn't evaluated that in terms of taking a mate either. As he followed Giselle into the dimly lit bar, he acknowledged his isolation could pose a problem for most females. Wolves were pack animals and most of them preferred it that way. A female often moved to her mate's pack, but sometimes it worked the other way. And a male switched locations. Jake hadn't thought about it before, but how many were females would willingly spend the rest of their lives as he did? Distance from any pack? He thought the spectacular setting created a decent trade-off, but would she? Maybe not. The bar was fragrant with the scent of fine liquor, expensive cigars, and expertly prepared food. The den's humble exterior disguised a venue that would satisfy the most discerning customer. Jake realized he was starving. Giselle was obviously known here. Customers called out greetings and she stopped to introduce Jake as they made their way to an empty table in a far corner. When they reached it, he held her chair. Thanks. She gave him a smile. Call me old-fashioned, but I love chivalrous. Gestures. Me too. As he sat down opposite her, he wished to hell he found her wildly sexy. Objectively speaking, she was extremely attractive, tall, graceful. Classic features, pretty hair. Logically he should want her, except he didn't. And unless he'd lost all perspective, she didn't want him either. She gazed at him with friendly interest, with not a trace of smoldering lust. Well, good. If she'd shown any signs of being attracted, he'd have an awkward situation on his hands. A waitress approached the table to take their order for drinks. Jake glanced over at Giselle. If you don't mind, I'm ordering food. I know I asked you to meet me for a drink, but I'm ordering food too. She opened the menu and snapped it shut again before gazing up at the waitress. Surf and turf for me. She looked at Jake. It's outstanding here, and I haven't stopped long enough to eat a decent meal in days. Then let's make that too. Giselle lifted her eyebrows. Wine. Let's order a bottle of red. I'm ready to stay a while, but if you need to get back, just say the word. The laundry pack can do without me for a few hours. She pulled a cell phone from a pocket of her leather jacket. In fact, I'm turning this off. Jake checked the wine offerings. May I suggest the Paradigm Shift Pinot Noir? The waitress said. It's local. Sounds great. Jake handed back the wine list. The evening had all the trappings of a romantic interlude, except that it lacked the necessary chemistry. Once the waitress had left, he turned to Giselle. You're now free to wine. She hesitated, as if debating whether to get into it. Then she groaned and covered her face with both hands. It's my big brother, although right now I feel years older than him. So what's he doing? Jake felt a pang of envy that she had a brother to be upset with. He had no siblings and would have loved having them, but he was the only offspring. That fact made him doubly determined to carry on the legacy of his mother's pack as best he could. Giselle sighed and settled back in her chair. Bryce is going crazy. Apparently, he's in line to be the next Landry Alpha, but last week he ran off to Vegas and has no immediate plans to come back. But he will eventually, right? Who knows? He texts every day, so we know he's alive, but he's not talking, not to me or my parents or Miranda, who'd agreed to become his mate within the next year. She's announced that she's free again, which only makes sense, considering how he's behaving. What about his friends? Can't they get through to him? Giselle shook her head. He's cut them off too. The only clue I have is that he'd started reading Duncan McDowell's blog because he mentioned it to me and wondered what I thought about Duncan's ideas on werewolf mating. Jake cursed softly under his breath. The Scottish were had organized wers optimizing our future the previous year to promote his belief that werewolf mating was inevitable and should be encouraged. He'd made serious inroads with that agenda during WerCon 2012. His popular blog continued to rally support for werewolf mating, and it looked as if he might have another well-placed convert. The heir apparent to the Landry pack would be a feather in Duncan's cap. I'm sure hearing that doesn't make you happy. Nope. I haven't told my parents about my suspicions because they'd hit the roof if they thought Bryce might consider a human mate. I hope his Vegas adventure is nothing more than sowing some wild oats and he'll come back ready to mate with Miranda and assume his responsibilities. But I don't know if he will or not. I'm sorry, Giselle. I wish there was something I could do. If I thought you could talk him into coming home, I'd beg you to go down there. But he has a stubborn streak and he'd dig in his heels if he thinks we're coercing him in any way. She paused as the waitress approached. Good. We have wine. I didn't realize how much we might need that tonight. Giselle chuckled. I did. I'm really glad you suggested this, Jake. I've wanted someone to talk to. You were at that conference. You saw how charismatic Duncan McDowell is. I do. Jake tasted the wine and signaled the waitress to fill both glasses. He got Kate Stillman to change her tune after all, and I thought she was firmly in the werewolf camp. Hell, I even like McDowell myself. It's hard not to when he's so sincere. Misguided but sincere. Well, let's drink a toast to my wayward brother and the possibility that he'll resist going over to Duncan's side. Jake raised his glass to Bryce Landry. May he fulfill his destiny with Miranda, the weremate he's pledged to. Here, here. Giselle touched her glass to his and drank. Then she put it down and picked up the bottle on the table. Paradigm Shift is her parents' label. Among other things, the Randolph Pack owns a winery in Napa, so naturally the Den will always recommend Wermade wine. They should. It's good wine. Jake took another swallow. It is, and until last week, Miranda's folks kept my folks well stocked with. Understandably, the Randolph Pack is being less friendly and less generous with their wine. It's all a mess and sad too. My parents get along great with her parents, or at least they used to. Now everyone's tiptoeing around the subject of Bryce's defection. Jake topped off their glasses. If he comes back, can he fix this? Probably. He can be a charmer. So he could show up and convince everyone to forgive him? Oh yes. But he could also mate with a topless Vegas dancer simply to prove a point. When we were children, he'd go along quietly for months, and then something would hit him wrong and he'd blow his stack in a rather spectacular fashion. I thought he'd outgrown that pattern, but apparently not. I think we should blame it all on Duncan McDowell. Giselle laughed. Wish I could, but we all have free will, Jake. She took another sip of her wine. Let's change the subject. I happen to know you didn't fly all the way down here to talk about my brother. What's up with Warm? It's growing. He briefly described the trips he'd made and the network he'd created. After their food arrived, she encouraged him to elaborate, and he became so engrossed in his subject that he barely noticed what he was eating. When the waitress came to clear their plates, he realized that he'd talked nonstop through the entire meal. Sorry about that, Giselle. It's a wonder I didn't put you to sleep with that monologue. I love listening to someone who's passionate about a cause. Yeah, for 5 minutes maybe. After that it's overkill. He grinned at her. I'm blaming Duncan McDowell. The thought of that were and all he stands for gets my blood pumping. Thanks for that. And now that I've bored you to death, can we stay for coffee? So I can ask you what I came down here for. Sure. Giselle caught the waitress's eye and ordered 2 coffees. Then she gazed across the table at Jake. I'll bet I know why you're here. Wouldn't be hard to guess. I want you to head up the Warm organization here in San Francisco. I can't. He didn't want to hear that. Giselle, at least think about it. I have. She reached across and touched his arm as if in silent apology. I knew that's why you were coming down, so I've given it plenty of thought. But I have several issues. One is that I'd have to resign from the council. I know. They'd served together on the council of the worldwide organization of werewolves under Howard Wallace, the council's first president. Although Jake had resigned, Giselle was still a member. I believe in WoW, Jake. I think I can do some good by being on the council. I used to think that you could help balance the scales, but I'm not sure that's possible. Considering that Howard's 2 sons are mated with humans, we can guess how the organization is going to evolve. You might be surprised. Now that Kate and Duncan are mated, she's having a steadying influence on WoW and on Duncan too. You're sure that's not wishful thinking? Jake still felt betrayed by that union. Kate used to be a powerful leader in the movement to end human sexual involvement. How she'd ended up with Duncan, who held the opposite view, was a mystery to Jake, and he didn't see how any good could come out of. I know he's still fire and brimstone on his blog, but privately he's less convinced he has all the answers. I know you think he's corrupted our Kate, but the sword cuts both ways. I also trust Howard not to send us off a cliff. The coffee arrived, which gave Jake a chance to regroup. He waited until she'd doctored hers with cream before throwing out a revised suggestion. Okay, so forget heading up the San Francisco division of Warm. You can work in the background and we'll put someone else in that position, someone you hand pick. He lifted the coffee mug to his lips. I can't do that either. He set the mug back down without drinking. Why not? It's all tied in with my brother. Before he left, I had my hands full as the chief accountant for Landry Enterprises. Now I'm doing that plus some of the board duties Bryce handled. Both Mom and Dad had to step back into positions. They turned over to Bryce as well. You must be ready to wring his neck. Her fingers tightened around her coffee mug. Pretty much. But that said, I'm going to tone down my activism for the time being. Bryce might screw up and mate with a human, and if he does, I'll be the family peacemaker. I always have been. So I need to leave myself some middle ground to stand on. Jake knew when he was fighting a losing battle. I understand. But if you'd be willing to recommend someone else from this area, that would help me. Be happy to. I know who would be perfect. I'll introduce you to Evan when we take our run tomorrow night. Do you have time for the run? Sounds to me as if you are stretched thin. Concern for her schedule wasn't his main reason for asking. With the evening drawing to a close, he became aware of a growing urge to scrap the rest of his plans and hop on a plane bound for home. When he'd left Polecat this morning, he'd been intent on putting distance between himself and Rachel. He'd accomplished that, but instead of relief he was battling an uneasy feeling that he needed to be at home to keep an eye on things. He might have underestimated Rachel's determination to find that big black wolf. It's all planned and I'd have some disappointed words if we didn't do. Unless you have to get back sooner. In which case we'll run without you, I guess. No, I don't have to get back. He just felt compelled to. Maybe he was spooked for no reason. I'd love to take that run. It'll give me a chance to talk with Evan. Then the run's a go. I didn't ask you how long you were staying. I hope at least a few more days so you can enjoy the city. That would be nice, but my flight leaves the morning after our run. That hadn't been his original itinerary, but it was now. Maybe he was being ridiculous to think Rachel might snoop around his place while he was gone, but he also couldn't remember locking his backslider. Damn, he might not have because he was so used to leaving it unlocked. Surely Rachel wouldn't consider actually going into his place uninvited, though. Yet he remembered her fury when he denied having a wolf on the premises. He hadn't lied. Strictly speaking, he wasn't a wolf. He only looked like one. Sometimes. But she'd acted as if he was hiding something, which he was. She also believed her wolf was being neglected by him. Her love of wolves might cause her to do something uncharacteristic like trespassing on his property. Well, so what if she did? She wouldn't find a wolf or any conclusive evidence. One had been there. But if she went so far as to dig through his stuff, that possibility made him nervous as hell. Yeah, he needed to get back, the sooner the better. It's a shame you can't stay longer, Giselle said. But if anybody understands tight schedules, it's me. Yep. Jake sipped his coffee. I can't let anything slip through the cracks.